Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our third annual Freedom Week. This is the biggest global undergraduate forum for conservative and libertarian ideas. It's one of the many proofs that we live in an exceptional country where liberty does not have to yield, as Thomas Jefferson warned in the early days of the Republic. Today's speaker is Dr. Burton Folsom. He earned his PhD in history from the University of Pittsburgh some 40 years ago. He was a professor here at Northwood between 1994 and 1999, and also during that period he was a senior fellow with the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He is a well-known contributor to the Wall Street Journal and an author of several books, and my students will be writing their final projects on the myth of the robber barons. Just a tip for you to know, to keep track of what's happening tonight. Take notes. You also know this is necessary for your extra credit if you need it. Some of the other famous works by Dr. Folsom is New Deal or Raw Deal, How FDR's Economic Legacy Has Damaged America, and also together with Lawrence Reed, who will be giving the closing speech here in this room 3 days from now on Thursday. He wrote A Republic If We Can Keep It, 5 years ago, published by the Foundation for Economic Education. I just learned that he is one of the few non-politicians who was able to visit all the 50 states in the Union. Before I hand it to him, I would like to note to everybody that surveys are available. If you forgot to pick one from the table outside, during the break between the lecture and the Q&A section, you can pick one and fill it in. It's provided by the IHS. Those surveys are necessary so that we can continue to have good relationships and receive funding. The funding for this event and the whole Freedom Week comes from the McNair Center, the Institute for Humane Studies, the John Templeton Foundation, the Forum for Citizenship and Enterprise here at Northwood, and the Charles Kline Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Burt Folsom from Hillsdale College.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Glad to be back at Northwood and talking to you about entrepreneurship and the history of entrepreneurship. Can you hear me back there? Can I reach everybody? Am I projecting loud enough? How many have one of these? Yeah. My hand's up too, obviously. Yeah, we most of us do. And how many of you have communicated with, let's just say, somebody who's at least, say, 500 miles or more away from here recently, today? How many have communicated with someone, let's say, at least 1,000 miles away in the last week? Isn't that kind of interesting? We just accept that, right? Overseas, how many have communicated with somebody overseas today? A lot, quite a few. We accept that as part of life. What we have to remember is in human history, it's been relatively recent that has been able to be the case. For most of history, the only way you could communicate with someone, at least immediately, I mean, you could write a letter or send a message. We even have that back in biblical times. You could have messengers that were hired to deliver information. But the only way you could communicate with somebody at least a little bit of a distance away, is by yelling like this, right? You know, Jerry, will you come over here? No. Or Cindy, will you go out with me this weekend? No. Right? And, oh, okay. You know, you just yell. So you might be able to communicate 100, 200 yards at the most. But as far as immediate communication, that's the longest you could do. Now, obviously today that's long been shattered. But I want you to think for a minute, how far back do we go with this? For example, 100 years ago, could you communicate with somebody at a long distance? 100 years ago? How many say yes, you can? What? How? Back at that.
Telegraph?
A telegraph? Right. That would be one way. Or a telephone. You could make a telephone call 100 years ago. Okay, you're right. So you could. You could. How about 200 years ago? Could you communicate with somebody a long way away, miles away? Would that be possible 200 years ago?
Smoke signal.
Smoke signal, I like that. Yeah, maybe smoke signal, but not any other way that customarily we think of today. So all of this is within the last 200 years. More specifically, it's the 1840s. The 1840s, we get the invention of the telegraph. 1870s, we get the telephone. But you get the telegraph in the 1840s. And I want you to think of that then, how dramatic that is. Because we think of changes today and having an impact of changes on our life. But imagine that you grow up and you could never communicate with anybody who's more than, 100 or 2 yards away or something like that. And then all of a sudden, with a telegraph, with a system of dots and dashes, developed by Samuel Morse, the Morse code, he found out that on a wire, you could take a wire, he's experimenting with this, on a wire, and you whack it with a metallic device, and it kind of goes, it reverberates. And that's what gives him the idea. If somebody is way at the other end of a wire, and you hit it, that impulse could reach them. And then you get a system of dots and dashes, like dot, and then hit it twice really quickly for dash. And then those indicate letters of the alphabet. And so you're spelling a message. And it becomes a telegram. And the instrument that he invented, the telegraph, in the 1840s. So we do get that invention, and that's in the history of entrepreneurship, that is a very important invention. Now let me put this in context. I said the 1840s. In the United States, of course, we get our independence, we have the Constitution, and we're paying off debts from the Revolutionary War and then the War of 1812. And we got them all paid off in the 1830s, 1835, 1836. I looked around, somebody was shocked. We had no national debt. We paid it all off. We had surpluses. Surpluses. Every year, the tax revenue would be here, and the federal expenses would be here. And it ended up, at the end of the year, we had more money in than we had spent. I enjoyed saying that so much, I want to say it again. During the 1930s, the revenue, without an income tax, by the way, the revenue would be up here, and the expenditures by the federal government would be here. So at the end of the year, we had paid off all our federal debt. We owed nothing. So now you have a surplus, and a political issue in the 1830s that was big is, what do we do with the leftover money? What do we do with this stuff? And President Andrew Jackson had an idea. He said, well, one way we could do it is by giving it back to the states. Giving it back at the end of the year to the states. And so we got, yeah, let's do it. And on the basis of population, you would get back, at the end of the year, you would get back revenue. Now, this connects with Michigan, by the way. Because in the 1835, 1836, when all this money was coming back each year to the states, because we had budget surpluses at the end of the year, Michigan was not in the Union. We were a territory. And therefore, we didn't get any money back. Michigan, we were pouting because Ohio got Toledo. That was the big dispute. It should have been in Michigan. If you take that line, it's the southern part of Lake Michigan, and cut it across, Toledo should be in Michigan, And Ohio got in the Union first, and they just took it. So we're not even going to join your silly union. And then all of a sudden, everybody's getting money, free money at the end of the year. And so in Michigan, our governor, Governor Mason, came up and said, President Jackson, let me get this straight. Every state in the union gets money back, free money at the end of the year. Yeah. But we're a territory and we get no money. Right. If we become a state, will we get money? Yeah. We'll get money for the whole year? Well, it depends on when you come in the union. It's prorated. So if you come in the union in December, you get 1/12 of a share. Says, okay, that's all I need to go. I'm going back to Michigan. And that helps explain why Michigan suddenly became a state in 1837 and why the month was January. We wanted that money. And so Michigan joined. By the way, we lost Toledo, so we said, we'll take part of Wisconsin. And so we chipped off the UP, the Upper Peninsula, and then we took that, and then Wisconsin had to deal with that when they became a state. So Ohio took Toledo, and in Michigan we took the UP. So anyway, we're in the union and getting money. Now, the reason I say that and connect that is that you think of this politically. Once you have a union, and once you have politicians who have surpluses, they're saying, they can't stand it. Just look at that money in there that I could bring in and spend. And so in the 1940s, we had a spending spree. And that's the last we ever had budget surpluses, at least. That's the last time we ever eliminated the national debt. The telegraph is going to fit in. So is the post office. The post office becomes a federal operation in the 1820s. And we also had steamship subsidies. Some of you are reading my book, The Myth of the Robber Barons. How many are reading that? A few of you? You know that Vanderbilt was running, and Edward Collins had steamship subsidies. And so we had, Collins had the steamship subsidies. Vanderbilt did not, and he competed against Collins, and Collins had the steamship subsidies. So what we have is, the idea is, we're going to make America great. I didn't say again because we weren't made great at all, so there was no again to it. But we're going to make America great by competing with England and other European countries. And the way we're going to compete is, we're going to use the federal government to subsidize, take this surplus, instead of giving it back to the states. Right as Michigan gets in the union, they decide not to do this anymore. And so we're going to spend the money, the federal government is going to spend it on steamship subsidies to compete with England for the steamship traffic overseas. We're going to do a federal mailing service through the post office. And we're going to take Samuel Morse's invention, the telegraph, and develop it. And we're going to build it out from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. That's 40 miles. We're going to build it out 40 miles. And we're going to run it as a government operation. And so we spent $30,000 for that. Now, what I'm telling you is that in the 1840s, we decide, gee, we have surpluses. Let's get the government involved in spending money. And we have what I would call political entrepreneurs, those interested in trying to achieve success by government spending, in operation with the post office, the steamships, and the telegraph. Now, you sit there and reflect on this. I want you to just think a minute. Imagine the profit you could make if you had a monopoly. You're the only telegraph company. It's the government-operated company. Now, it starts Washington, D.C. They built telegraph wires from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. But that's toward Philadelphia and toward New York. That's the first step. Later the idea is we'll make it profitable for those 40 miles, and then once it's profitable, we will expand it. So imagine this is a government. Some of you might be thinking, well, we're going to get back to having surpluses again because you'll make so much money. There are lots of things you can do with a telegraph to make money. the way you have a telegram, of course, is somebody comes into your office. You have an office. And they say, I want to send the following message, and then they have a telegrapher who's there, who knows the Morse code, the dots and dashes, and he takes your message, and you're paid by the word. And then he sends out the message to the telegrapher at Baltimore. And then somebody at Baltimore, 40 miles away, can get what you have to say. He thought, what? Wait. Who can help me here? I have a copy of my book, Uncle Sam Can't Count, which is about the telegraph and a whole bunch of entrepreneurial inventions. I want to give this to someone who can tell me, what sorts of things can you imagine that you could make money with a telegraph? Help me somebody. Yeah, come on, here, come on up. Come on up. I want to give you the book. First, I want to hear your answers. What could you do?
You could advertise things. So if you're selling one thing in one city, you could advertise it in another city, whether it's services or goods.
Like, in other words, advertise in Baltimore for DC services and,
Yeah.
and vice versa.
Yep.
Right. Anything else? Because that's good. Advertise for services.
You could offer somebody maybe rides back and forth.
Rides. And you could conduct that. That's good. Good. You're on a roll. What else? I'll sign it for you while you think of something else, because you've got good ones there.
You could probably pass information along.
Hey, that's good. What kind of information might be worth paying for?
Maybe informational stuff as far as like knowing maybe more lectures or more advertising.
Lectures. Boy, professors like to hear that. Yeah, my lecture is here. Yeah. No, can you see? Yeah, here you go. Take that. Thank you. What's your name?
Austin.
Austin. Thank you, Austin. Let's hear it for Austin. Austin is right on target there. Like the police, like a criminal just escaped, and here's an identification of him to the police department. You can imagine weather conditions for storms and that sort of thing to get a handle on that people might want to pay. One of the biggest uses that had potential is financial information, like stock market prices. Imagine Wall Street. Baltimore's getting close. Baltimore's closer to New York than Washington. If you had somebody who could get to Baltimore to New York, you could get stock prices. In D.C., you could learn about it quicker that way. And so financial information, and Austin alluded to that a little bit in what he was saying. All of this. Now, mind you, the government is in a position to have total monopoly of this. And what I think the defense of having the government, you might think, well, why should the government be in control? Why shouldn't it be privatized? The Postmaster General, Cave Johnson, who said, the government needs to be in charge of the mail because the government is the only one who can handle mail responsibly. He made this statement about the telegraph. Quote, the telegraph, so powerful for good or evil, cannot, with safety to the people, be left in the hands of private individuals, uncontrolled by law. The telegraph, so powerful for good or evil, cannot, with safety to the people, safety to the people, be left in the hands of private individuals, uncontrolled by law. So it must be a federal operation, therefore. All that money then comes into the federal government. Well, the expenses you have for the telegraph are you have to set up the wire from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, and you have to have telegraphers in both cities doing messages. Plus, you might have an assistant. You have to have the upkeep of an office and maybe an assistant in both places. So the costs are not too great, especially the fixed costs are out of the way once you get the poles up and the wires up. Then the money is going to roll in. What we discovered the first year, it was built in 1844, the first year for the end of 1844 and the first half of 1845, the expenses exceeded the revenue by a ratio of 6 to 1. The expenses under government operation exceeded the revenue by a ratio of 6 to 1. That is, every dollar that was taken in by somebody buying a telegram, you had $6 spent in upkeep and paying the staff, which isn't that much. Now, Postmaster Johnson, who said it had to be a government function, it was too powerful, he said every business at the outset loses money. But now it won't lose money because it'll get better. It'll change. Be ready for change. By the end of 1845, we had change. And the ratio was no longer 6 to 1, it was 10 to 1. In other words, it got worse. And at that point, Postmaster Johnson, who said, "The telegraph, so powerful for good or evil, cannot with safety to the people be left in the hands of private individuals uncontrolled by law," decided with all of these negative outflows of cash that maybe the people could be trusted. That maybe we needed to take the telegraph, sell it to a private individual or company, get the revenue, and let them be the ones to lose the money. And so we sold it to Ezra Cornell. Now, the fact that he later started Cornell University is a clue that he didn't perform too poorly. He bought it and started the company Western Union to be a telegraph company. He took advantage of all of this information that we were talking about. He also expanded it. He said the government was losing money and wouldn't even expand it. And he expanded it to Philadelphia and New York. And at that point, New York could be connected with D.C. And you had a flood of telegraph information where stock prices were being sent back and forth, where people would pay a lot just to regularly get stock information. So people were buying like dozens of telegrams every day to get stock prices so that they could buy and sell. And they could do sell orders to the broker from hundreds of miles away. I mentioned more police reports. Friends and family would send information like I'm traveling from Washington to Philadelphia, and they'd say, "Send us a telegram when you arrive so we know you got there safely." What we do with a telephone call today. That would be a telegram. The telegraph became one of the most popularly used items in American society. He increased the mileage, Western Union and Ezra Cornell, from 40 miles in 1846 to 23,000 miles 6 years later, 1852. So in other words, he's taking the profits and building more wire, so he's up to New York. Then he goes from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, then to Cleveland, Detroit, right? We're just going all over then in the South. We're building telegraph wires, and every time we do that, it connects more of the country, and he's making money. By 1860, the telegraph had gone across the country to San Francisco. So now you could connect the whole country. The whole country was connected by a telegraph. By 1869, we built an underground telegraph in the Atlantic Ocean, at the bottom of the ocean. So now you can connect England in the United States. Now, I want to describe you, this is the story of the telegraph, and I want to sort of summarize it here this way. The telegraph is invented privately by Samuel Morse. The government says, we'll build it and run it, and he agrees, and the government builds the 40 miles. They lose money in the year or so that they operated it. They turned it over to private enterprise, and it became one of the most profitable institutions. Other telegraph companies came in to compete with Ezra Cornell. There are a multitude of telegraph companies. Western Union was the biggest. AT&T, that's part of that. Telephone and Telegraph Company. You had all sorts of companies coming in to compete. It was a major, big corporation business. Within 6 years, we go from 40 to 23,000 miles. By 8 years later, we've connected anywhere in the country. Every major city in the country is connected. 9 years later, you have underground cable overseas, across the Atlantic Ocean. So what I'm saying, in government operation, they lost money, sold it at the end of 1 year, and 23 years later, the whole world practically was connected, and the country was connected. Wow. How many knew the story of the Telegraph? Let's see. How many think that something like that would be useful to know when making public policy judgments about government-operated enterprises versus privately operated enterprises? Yeah. Everything that the government touched in the 1840s to go into debt went sour. The telegraph investment was poor. The steamship investment was terrible. We gave the steamship subsidies to Edward Collins to do a steamship traffic overseas to England, from England to New York. It was the first time we could go quickly overseas with steamships. We cut the cost of travel. It was 3 months that Columbus took to go overseas. We could do it in less than 2 weeks with steamships. That was the big innovation of the 1800s. Steamships could do it that quickly. We decided to subsidize a company. They went broke. A private company run by Cornelius Vanderbilt succeeded. That's my first chapter in the book, Myth of the Robber Barons. And then we decided, with the post office, we didn't change out the post office. It took several years before we got FedEx in, and we had UPS, and we had a genuine competition with the post office. But the post office has continued to be a government operation and has lost money every year. Had we privatized that as well, the government probably would not have lost money there. We probably would have, it would have been like the telegraph and the steamships. The private owners, as they do now with FedEx, make money every year, and the federal operation loses money every year. We had a splurge in the 1840s, and it was a disaster. We decided when it came to the railroad, let's try it again. The Transcontinental Railroads, the Union Pacific, federally funded from Omaha to California. The problem here with that railroad is the same problem we had with the telegraph. Let me put it this way. When you had the telegraph, when the government owned it, the people who were the government bureaucrats in charge, they got paid whether there were any telegrams delivered or not. If you're a telegraph operator, you could be sleeping on the job and it's, oh no, I have to wake up. Somebody's actually here with a telegram for me to send. When Ezra Cornell takes over, he says, well, the more telegrams that are sent, the more money I can make, so I'm going to incentivize my staff. The more telegrams they send, the more I'll pay them. And everybody gets in on the incentives, and he cuts the price of sending telegrams so that more people will want to send them. And you end up with a lucrative operation. But with the government, you're a bureaucrat and you're paid whether telegrams are sent or not. The incentives were terrible for making it a successful operation. The same thing happened with the Transcontinental Railroads. The Union Pacific Railroad was federally subsidized and failed. The Central Pacific Railroad was federally subsidized and failed because we paid them by the mile. And they said, you mean we're paid by the mile to go across the country? We said, yes. And they said, oh, good. And here's the railroad. The Union Pacific started looking like this. I gave this lecture once, and I had somebody at the back at the end of the lecture and raised his hand. He said, I'd like you and everybody else in this room to know that I just retired last year from a lifetime of work with the Union Pacific Railroad. I worked at this railroad. I said, well, what can you tell us, sir? He said, I want you to know something. We're still trying to straighten that railroad out. Yeah. Because, see, when you're paid by the mile, it looks like this. You don't have any incentive to build the things. Oh, once we got to the mountains. Well, if you had built the road privately, as James J. Hill did with the Great Northern, he came along after all these disastrous, bankrupt federal roads, and he built a transcontinental railroad with no federal subsidy. It was the only one that was profitable. And what he said was, these people are just building like this. He said, I build like that. It's my money and my profit. And then they said, well, what about the mountains, the federally subsidized railroads? You get to a mountain, they just kind of go up the mountain and down the mountain. He says, it's stupid because look at the fuel it takes to go up the mountain and down the mountain, and that assumes you can even make it up. He says, if a mountain looks like this, right, then it has to go down somewhere, and I want to weave my way through the down places. He hired Indian scouts to find a way through the Rocky Mountains so he could get a flat grade through the mountains with his Great Northern, and he did. He had arguably the best built railroad in the country, the Great Northern Railroad. It made money every year. When the Panic of 1893 hit, all the other transcontinentals went broke or went under, went bankrupt, and his railroad was successful. The Union Pacific went broke. The Central Pacific was reeling from problems. And the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe did not do well, but the Great Northern was profitable. Because it was a private, he said, I built a privately built railroad. My incentives were to build a good railroad, and I did. Now, when that railroad flopped, the federally funded part of it, that is, and the privately part of it succeeded, American politicians actually learned something. I have to say this. I teach history. And when you teach history, you don't see a lot of learning curve. And I always get excited because we learned. The politicians said, I don't care if the United States becomes a great industrial power or not. We either will do it or we won't do it because of our entrepreneurs. We're not going to do any more to this. Government jumpstart an industry. That's out. When oil came in, when chemicals here at Dow Chemical, great industries came to the fore in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Typewriters were invented. The automobile was invented. The telephone was invented. Can't you just imagine Alexander Graham Bell and the invention of the telephone? That first ring, he picks it up. I'm glad it wasn't a telemarketer. The telephone's a major invention. The washing machine is invented in the late 1800s. You get a lot of incredible inventions in the late 1800s. And sometimes people who are trying to invent these products said, whoo, let's get a government grant. Nope, it all had to be done privately. The Americans took the lead in industry after industry after industry. We dominated the world in oil, chemicals, in steel production. Sometimes we had a protective tariff, but none of this federal subsidy stuff. And the end result was the United States rose to become a great power. All of these industries, we tended to dominate them. Even chemicals with Herbert Dow competing against the Germans dominated the chemical industry, defeated the Germans, and aspirin ended up being produced here in the United States. Novocaine, the Germans produced it at $160 an ounce. And I mean, back 100 years ago, that's a hugely expensive price. Dow got it down to a fraction of that, and he ended up dominating the world market. So what we have is Herbert Dow, others became very competitive. Now, it raises the question, and I want to sort of begin to finish up by saying, how did we go astray in the 1900s? History taught us some clear lessons in the 1800s. Federal subsidies flopped when entrepreneurs took over much more successfully. We built 4 transcontinentals, 3 fail, 1 succeeds. The 3 that failed were government funded. The one that succeeded, no federal funding. The story of the Telegraph. The story of the steamships. The bad example of the post office losing money every year. It was all there. How in the world do we come back? And I need to explain that because it was the invention of the airplane. Yeah, the invention of the airplane. Now you're thinking, how could the invention of the airplane, or I should say this, the prospect of inventing the airplane. See the logic. I want you to see the logic here. Lots of people wanted to be the one to invent an airplane. The Germans were trying to invent it. The English were trying to invent it. The French were trying to invent it. And they even were publishing journals on aerodynamics, trying to get a critical mass of scholarly thought developed in a way so that their country could be the one to develop this invention. If you are the country that invents the airplane, think of the military advantage you have. Germany, just the fun thought of dropping bombs on France spurred them. France lost to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, and they thought, revenge is sweet. Fly that baby up at Paris, over to Berlin, boom. President Theodore Roosevelt and others said, if America is not first to invent the airplane, some country can come over to New York City or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. for that matter, drop the bombs, and we might have the best military weapons available, and we might have the strongest army and the most physically fit people, and we lose. And Roosevelt said, are we just going to sit here and let the free market someday invent the airplane, and while we're waiting for the free market to invent the airplane, meanwhile, the Germans invent it instead, and we're sitting there tinkering, and they drop bombs on us, and that's the end of us. Are we going to put up with that? No. What we need to do is get the government involved. This is one exception now. And let's pick the guy who knows the most about aerodynamics. See if he would be willing to invent the airplane, give him a subsidy, and then we invent it first. Now, free markets are good in the area of Telegraph and Transcontinental Railroad, but this is life or death military with the airplane. Many Americans were skeptical. But they said, do we have someone who fits this category of being knowledgeable about aerodynamics? And Roosevelt said, yes, we do. The president of the Smithsonian Institution, one of our most decorated scientists, Samuel Langley. He's the man. Samuel Langley. Why, they said, was Langley? Well, number one, he has written a book called Experiments in Aerodynamics. He's played around with this. He developed a miniature airplane without a person on it, like a toy airplane. And he put a little engine on it, and he flew it across the Potomac River there in Washington, D.C. He flew it over the river. He has honorary degrees from Harvard and Yale and Oxford and Cambridge. He may be America's most famous scientist since Benjamin Franklin. Let's ask him and see if he would be willing to devote full time to inventing this airplane if we give him a subsidy. Langley was brought before Congress and asked. you think you can do this job? And Langley said, I volunteer to receive a subsidy. And to do the job. He said, I may. It's in the off chance that I don't do it the first time. Give me enough for 2 flights. Just give me enough for 2 flights and I'll get it done. And that's exactly what we did. And Langley went to work at the turn of the century, early 1900, building that airplane. And he had it built, and he had an interesting theory of flight. If you were to watch this go on, his building his airplane, the thing that would surprise you is that his plan was to take the airplane out on a houseboat. You're thinking of a runway, right? He said, no. This can be launched from a houseboat in the middle of the Potomac River. And they said, what? How do you do that? He said, you do it like a catapult. How many know how many played Angry Birds? Right? Angry Birds. It's like Angry Birds. Well, we didn't have that then, so he didn't say that. But I'm saying it to you. He was thinking of something like Angry Birds. He said, you get a catapult device, you pull it back like a huge rubber band. Well, you get it back, and then you have the engine and the plane and the wings, and it's all there, and then you shoot it into the air. Then, once it's in the air, he said, the key thing is your engine is then going. So once the engine's going, then you just keep going. And they said, boy, you've got really good plans for your flight. And he said, well, actually, I think I'm going to have someone else fly. And he had another person hired, an Ivy League student. He said, it has to be Ivy League, to fly my plane. And so he had a young guy who was a recent college graduate come out, and he was the pilot. And Langley had sewed into his pants a compass. He said, when you're up there flying, you're going 10 miles or whatever, I want you to be sure to know north, east, west, and all that. He said, okay, got it. So I got the compass sewn in. And on the day it came, he had a 21-gun salute so that the reporters and everybody could know, here's the day that America invents the airplane. And we went back, and they pulled back on the catapult device. Shot it in the air. Crash right into the Potomac. The pilot, they managed somehow to rescue. He didn't drown. He got out of that. They fished him out of the water. And I wanted to read. I've done research on this, and I wanted to get good sources from witnesses. And the best source in Washington is the Washington Post. It's the newspaper of record. And so their journalist who was there watching it summarized Langley's flight in 13 words. This is the story, 13 words. Any stout boy of 15 could have skimmed an oyster shell much farther. And Langley said, wait. Whenever inventors are at work, failure is look at Edison. Look at the light bulb, one of the big inventions in the late 1800s. Edison had to have many failures. Listen, give me one more chance and we're going to get this worked out. So, on December 8th, 1903, comes flight number 2. They actually got the same guy to be the pilot who flew the first one. We tweaked it. Langley said, no, in some ways I would like to do this myself, but we're going to let this other fellow, his name was Charles Manley, we're going to let him do it. So they got together, they got on the houseboat, they pulled back the catapult device. Let it go! Crash! This time the newspapers were not so courteous. The Boston Herald said, Professor Langley needs to quit experimenting with airplanes and try his hand at submarines. The New York Times said, the reason failure resulted is because it is too complicated for human beings to do at this stage of our development. They said if we get mathematicians and engineers working full time, we probably won't be able to get an airplane for 1 million years. The New York Times was off in its estimate by 999,999 years and 356 days. 9 days after they made that statement, the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, who'd never been to college, flew the first airplane 59 seconds at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They experimented with their own runway going down a hill. They had the pilot was on the airplane, operating the wings. They worked out the whole thing. They rejected the catapult theory completely. Privately, it was accomplished 9 days after Langley's second failure. The Wright brothers said, we only flew for almost 1 minute. We're going to have to lengthen that because if it's going to be profitable. Because most people who might want to fly have a destination further than 59 seconds. And so let's get it so we can go a long way and go from city to city. And they had the first airport there outside of Dayton, Ohio. It's called Huffman Airport, still there. And they experimented with planes trying to do longer and longer flights. They got better and better until finally they could do several hours. And then they said, at this point, we're ready, maybe not for commercial flights, but maybe to sell a plane to the military. And they called it their Wright, after the Wright brothers, the Wright Flyer. Model number 3, because they went through 2 different models, and then the third one they settled on. The Wright Flyer number 3. They offered to the U.S. government for $25,000. And they said, you had a subsidy of much greater than that, and I'm offering it to you. That'd be about $1 million today for $25,000. The military said, before we accept it, maybe we don't want to accept it. I don't know if you can do the job. They actually had 2 other options that were presented to them. The first were the French. The French came up to them and said, look, United States, this airplane stuff is never going to work. The wave of the future for flight is big, we would call them today, helium balloons. They were hydrogen powered then. You get a balloon, you go up in the air, and then you move around in the balloon. That's the wave of flight in the future. And we just happen to have a balloon that will sell you. So we had a possibility of buying the Wright brothers plane, or we could buy the French balloon. And then we had a third possibility, because Samuel Langley said, if you'll just give me another subsidy, I will do it a third time successfully. He actually had supporters. Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, was there in Congress saying, you need to give Langley a chance. And one of the people who was testifying said, you invested this money in Langley. If you fail to follow through, you will admit you wasted it. So Congress had a choice. They could either buy the Wright, and they said, we got to do something. And they did do something. they've either can buy the Wright brothers airplane, they can buy the balloon from the French, or they can subsidize Langley for a third attempt. And I have a question for you. Which one do you think that they did, that Congress did? They're going to do one of them. I'd like to take a vote. Yeah. Did they buy the Wright brothers plane? Did they buy the balloon from the French? Or did they spend the money subsidizing Langley for another attempt? How many think they bought the Wright brothers plane? One. This is the most cynical audience I've ever spoken before. One person! Who is it back there? Yeah, you think they bought the Wright brothers plane?
Yes.
That's okay.
I wouldn't hear about it.
Okay. How many think they bought the balloon from the French? Uh-oh. I think I know the drift here. How many think that they gave Langley another subsidy? Oh my goodness. The overwhelming majority says you think that they gave Langley a subsidy to try again. And in this case, the majority of you, the majority, are wrong. They're wrong. No. In fact, it was funny in the congressional debate. One congressman said, the only thing Langley ever made fly was government money. No, they didn't give Langley a subsidy. They bought the balloon. They bought the balloon. The Wright brothers were told they just didn't know if this was an enterprise that they could invest in. It's too shaky. The French balloon looked like it was more secure, and so we invested the money and bought the balloon. Now, some of the government, even bureaucrats, some of them, were suspicious. And what made them suspicious that maybe they had not made the right decision was that the French, after selling us the balloon, invited the Wright brothers to do a test run in Paris, and with the possibility of offering to buy the airplane. So that made us very suspicious that they would sell us the balloon and then invite the Wright brothers over to do a demonstration. The Wright brothers went over there and flew overhead for hours, after which the French said, we want to buy one. And so the government said, uh-oh, we better buy one too. So because the French wanted to buy one, we bought one. And that's how we got the government to buy an airplane. Let's hear it for them. Yeah. Now you guessed the Wright brothers back there? Okay, come on up. Let me give you something. I want to give you a copy of the book too. Listen, I wish they had. Everything in me wishes they had given it to the Wright brothers, but they didn't. And here's the story. I tell it in this book, and so you'll never have to miss that question again. Let me sign it for you. Here we go. I signed it earlier. My wife signed it too because she co-authored that one. You are welcome. Good. Now, I want to put some finishing touches and then open it up for questions. One of the bad things here is not just bad entrepreneurship on the part of the federal government. History shows that. What I'm saying is that once you get started down this path, then Roosevelt wanted to invest in other enterprises. We had more government intervention. Roosevelt wanted to invest in the income tax, or wanted the government to start the income tax. The income tax is started in what year? I hope Northwood students know the infamous year of the income tax. 19. You have a 99-to-1 chance here of guessing some date for 19. It was 1913. The top rate was 7% that anybody could pay. It was progressive. But now I want you to see something. Once you've established the principle that a government can take from one group and not tax others as much, the politicians can then say, ooh, we have programs and we'll give them to you and we'll make this group pay for them. If we tax a millionaire half of his income, that's $500,000, and then we give 50 people $10,000, we win 50 votes and we only lose one. The progressive income tax had that kind of excitement. You have a 7% tax in 1913. It goes into the 20s in the 1920s. It's raised under Hoover in the early 30s. Under Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal in the 1930s, it goes up to 79% on top income. Then Roosevelt, in the 40s, raised the income tax to 94% on all income over $200,000. That means that if you earn $300,000 on that third $100,000, you get to keep, if it's 94%, you get to keep how much? $6,000. And you send $94,000 to the government. Roosevelt said that's not enough for the government. He proposed a 99.5% tax on all income over $100,000. Congress would not vote it in. Then he said, I'll issue an executive order for a 100% income tax on all income over $25,000. Congress voted it out after the executive order came in April 1942. Then Roosevelt said, and he got Congress behind it, I propose a 100.6% tax on millionaires. In other words, if you earn on everything over $1 million, you pay 100.6%. Does that make you want to work hard? In other words, if you earn $1 million of, and let me make this straight because I misstated a little bit earlier. If you earn $1 million total, your tax bill is $1,006,000. How many knew about that? How many think maybe that ought to be taught in history? It is taught in a book I wrote called FDR Goes to War. Now, I think I got into the congressional record because I think you might be interested. What did Congress say about the 100.6% income tax? Let me quote Senator Chandler, A.B. Chandler of Kentucky. He said this. He's on the Senate floor. He says this. Mr. President, all of us owe the government. We owe it for everything we have. And that is the basis of obligation. And the government can take everything we have if the government needs it. The government can assert its right to have all the taxes it needs for any purpose, either now or at any time in the future. Grim today, I haven't heard anybody make that argument yet. And I mean, I waited. I listened to Bernie really hard, but even he didn't say that. He never did. I waited for it, too. Now, I know some of you are thinking, if you have a 100.6% tax, how do you live? Well, that came up in the debate. I thought you might want to know that. It comes up, we're debating it in the Senate and the House. Congressman Charles Gifford of Massachusetts says this, because this is supposed to be a 3-year tax of 100.6% for 3 years. And Gifford says, for 3 long years he has to pay more than he receives. How does he pay his other taxes? How does he meet his living expenses? Democrat Jerry Cooper from Tennessee answered. He said this: it may not be possible to pay more than 1 year's taxes out of 1 year's income. I like that profoundness, you know. If it's 100.6, that does make that tricky. It may not be possible to pay more than 1 year's taxes out of 1 year's income, but with few exceptions, persons in the higher brackets have assets they can use to pay it. In other words, if you're so wealthy as to have an income of $1 million, you probably have a big house and everything, and you could sell that and live off that. This was a debate that was actually taking place, and the debaters were serious. They were serious. I want to give this book away, too. Who wants a copy of this book? Whoever comes back down first and gets it. Well, you got to grab it! Grab it! I'll sign it. I like it. People who sit at the front deserve a break. There it is. And I want you to read that whole chapter on taxation. Will you read that whole chapter? Yes. Now, I think we're ready for, how many want some question and answer? You have a good, my concluding statement is, once you go down the road of subsidies, not only do the subsidies not work historically, but it gets government in the mode of increasing the taxation for ever more subsidies, and it has an unlimited appetite, and you zip up to 100%. And now you ask your question. Go ahead.
Oh, well, what do you think it was a good idea to tax?
Do we have somebody with a microphone? I want this young lady to be heard. Here, I'll give you mine. Here you go.
Okay. My question was, what made them think it was a good idea to tax the rich more? Because wouldn't that make the rich want to store their money somewhere else outside of the U.S.?
Did you hear that good question? Wouldn't it make the rich, if you tax them 100%, wouldn't it make them want to go elsewhere? Yeah. And we never really, it's such a good question. What they were going to say is that if they do, we will have exit taxes. See, because one set of taxes has more regulations, so then you'll have to have an exit tax. But I want you to notice something. You pass a bad law, and then you have to have all sorts of regulations to enforce it. It was also supposed to be only for 3 years. So they said, after 3 years, we'll go back to letting you have 6% of your income, and we'll only tax you 94%. Isn't that comforting? Don't you? Wow, we get to keep 6%. Woo! Now, other questions? Alex, do you have a, yeah.
When was the first flat tax proposed after all those progressive taxes?
Oh, good. He's asking, when was the first flat tax proposed after all these progressive taxes? We actually started, the first income tax ever was during the Civil War and was a flat tax. It was then another one was proposed in the 1890s. It was 2% on all income across the board. That never became law. The Supreme Court struck it down. Interesting. Then the first federal income tax was 7% on top incomes, but most people paid 0, so it was progressive. After that, we never have had a serious run at a flat tax. Steve Forbes proposed it in earnest 20 years ago, 1996. And there was some talk even before that of a flat tax. The closest we came were the 1920s when Andrew Mellon actually cut the rate for a little bit, and he made it flatter. But even then, it wasn't a flat tax. So the flat tax is a really good idea, but it's never, with the politicians, had traction. And if you think about the logic, look, again, think of it, even a 50% tax. Somebody earns $1 million. Let's say you earn $1 million. Does that sound like fun? Yeah. She likes it. She likes it. $1 million, it's a 50% tax. It's not as fun then, right? Okay, 50%. Now, I'm a bureaucrat, and that, of course, pays my salary. Plus, I have expenses and vacations I want to take, too. So that cuts a lot of it out. But even with that, I have maybe 350,000 left. And so then 10,000 goes to the first 35 people here. And then when I run for office, I say, let's continue this tax system. And I have 35 potential votes here. Are you going to vote for me? No, I lose one. 35-1. But then I say, the rich over here, the greedy rich won't pay their fair share. And any politician who says, this is stupid, let's cut this tax rate and raise maybe a rate a little bit on other people, it's, you hate the poor. A tool of the rich. And therefore, it's very hard to get that rate. Once it starts going up, it's hard to get it down. But I'll tell you one thing, I'm excited because that 94% rate in World War II that we talked about under Franklin Roosevelt, see, people ask me, am I optimistic or pessimistic? Answer, optimistic. Because I got to live through the era when it was 90. When I was in college, it was, or I should say, well, middle school, it was still 90. And then we cut it. And then we cut it again under Reagan, and it got down to a top rate of 28%. In other words, 40 years after it was 94, it was 28 top rate. Now, that is exciting to me. Because once we got it down to 28, that's when we had the big boom. Silicon Valley, you get Microsoft founded. Google is a little bit later going to be founded. So you get the California entrepreneurs and the Washington entrepreneurs, Amazon.com, Washington, and of course Google in California. And you have all the computer chips, all of that going on. You know, microwave ovens, all of the development of the new technology. Not to mention Steve Jobs eventually, right, with our iPhones. All of this wonderful technology came through once we took those rates down. That's exciting because it demonstrates that if we'll get the message out, the good things that can be accomplished when we tell people you get to keep what you earn. I'm so excited I don't want to fall down over this. The 100% tax almost did me in. You get to keep what you earn. Most of what you earn you get to keep versus most of it you pay to the government. The degree to which people are willing to work when they get to keep the stuff that they earn is phenomenal. It's a lesson learned. It's one of the biggest lessons that history teaches us. And once we get back to teaching that lesson, discovering the lesson, learning the lesson, the United States can make a tremendous comeback and be very, very effective. Because a lot of that entrepreneurial talent is waiting to be unleashed if we give it the right incentives in the area of regulation and taxation.
Okay. So you brought some anecdotes with you that you possibly cherry-picked from the whole history of the U.S. Tinkering with enterprise.
Yeah.
Couldn't somebody come in here with their own opposing anecdotes and convince us that, in fact, government has a pretty good record? Or are these anecdotes somehow statistically conclusive evidence that this is what's been happening?
Good. One of the reasons that you don't hear anecdotes on the other side is that there are so few of them that they can't be presented because they don't exist. And you know, I always love a good debate. It would be fun to have somebody come up here and use arguments in favor of the federal government. But I have to say this, in looking at the flow of American history, I think I've understated the proposition because I only had an hour. For example, whenever we've had these bursts of entrepreneurship, what usually accompanies it is a decline in the federal debt. Remember how I talked about the invention of the light bulb and the telephone and the typewriter and the oil industry and steel? We had 28 straight years of budget surpluses from 1865 to 1893. We had 23 years of straight budget surplus, the national debt declined in the 30s. In other words, when all these inventions were being done, we withdrew the government to turn the entrepreneurs loose. And we not only got the benefit of the entrepreneurs and their inventions, which I've talked about, I haven't even talked about the benefits to our federal debt declining, and therefore the burden that we ultimately were having to pay also declined. So I think that the case that I made is understated rather than being overstated. Your assignment for tomorrow: invent something, market it, and then be the subject of my next book and lecture. Oh, is there a question?
Yes, I was wondering if you have an opinion about the government holding the majority of the shares of a company.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear the question.
Do you have an opinion when a government holds the majority of the shares in a company?
What happens when the government holds a majority of the shares in a company? Are you thinking, is there a particular example you're thinking of?
Well, in Eastern Europe, in Poland,
Yeah.
where I come from, the biggest companies are still partially owned by the government.
How do they work?
Well, as far as I know, the government can put pressure on the CEOs because they hold the shares.
This is what happened in England after World War II. We haven't had this as much in the United States, but it happened in England with the steel industry and with the railroads. And what we saw is that England, we had declines because you can't really get innovation under that system very easily. Let me put it that way. It's difficult to get innovation. You get innovation. Try to think back. One of the reasons I started with the Telegraph is because I thought it's an example that combines a lot of details. I mean, you see this. When we told Steve Jobs, you get to keep most of what you earn if you can put this together. He knew I wanted this before I knew I wanted it. That's pretty good entrepreneurship. He sat there and thought, Burt Folsom wants one of these, and so and everybody here at Northwood, because I asked you all, you had one too. Practically everybody wants one, and so he had the incentive. He may lose a lot of money trying, couldn't he? But he has a huge upside. Whenever the government is heavily invested in an enterprise, they're salaried workers, and they're reluctant to innovate because there's no way to easily give the inventor the proper credit for the invention. Everybody kind of gets a salary. And so instead of taking chances and trying to come up with something completely new like this, you end up doing the same old thing again and again, drawing your salary, and then you have no real innovation. I just have to say the historical record is that that's what tends to happen. Now, it would be nice if we had some examples that's why I asked you. There may be somebody who's figured out a way to make it work. I don't know of any enterprise that's heavily dominated by the government that has ever really been very innovative and worked very well.
We're doing this on purpose now.
Make him run, that's right. When he goes over there to get a question, I want one of you to raise your hand after that. Make Dr. Tokarov run.
When in American history did the national debt start to grow out of hand so quickly?
Yeah.
And why today is it so out of hand? And is there any hope in returning the national debt back to, or diminishing it?
Is there any hope? Yeah, I think there's always hope because it requires a change of attitude. After the Civil War, we had a national debt of $2.7 billion. 50 years later, it was $1.1 billion. We cut it more than half. Then it goes up with the huge federal spending. Also, World War I, World War II contributed strongly. It passed $1 trillion 30 years ago. 30, might have been 32 years ago. It was during Reagan. It passed $1 trillion, and now it's almost 20 trillion. So the big jump has been recently, when there hasn't been a real serious war. I mean, like of the scale of World War I, World War II. It has simply been politicians saying, I can spend lots of money, and the future generation will pay for it. But that future generation is not voting yet. So I want to get votes now by offering money that your children and grandchildren will have to pay, and you distribute it now to get votes. And as long as we have that attitude, and as long as Americans are not willing to stop it, and we have been upon occasion historically, until such time as we're willing to stop that and insist that we do as we've done in the past, like that half century after the Civil War, and demand financial accountability, we'll probably continue to go into debt, and it could be a huge bankruptcy. Now, I told you I'm optimistic. I think, because I think the evidence is so strong on our side. I like the idea of let's put the best side argument here and the best argument over here, and then let's let people think about it. And I think that that's a good way to win the debate, because I think so much information is on our side that I think that people will wake up, and therefore I'm optimistic.
So you were talking about the national debt, but realistically, who's going to enforce it? It's not like any other countries are going to call in the debts, like China isn't going to call it.
Yeah, okay, if I understood your question, you know, like China, we owe it. A lot of it, debt we owe in savings bonds. And so what happens are treasury notes. In other words, the government borrows money, and then they agree a month later to pay it back with, say, 1 or 2% interest. Then they'll pay it back, and then they'll borrow more to pay it back. As long as people believe that the United States is good for it, we'll continue to have people who buy our debt. The problem is going to come, and we've seen it with Greece and Portugal. The problem comes when people say, I don't know if they're good for it or not, because then you have to pay a high interest rate to get the money, if you can get it at all. I know there are a lot of people in the government who say if that comes, we'll simply print banknotes up and inflate our way out. But what that means is that the money in your wallet, from one day to the next, your $10 bill will now be worth $1. And I have a feeling there will be a big-time rebellion when you go to McDonald's and they have a special on Big Macs, $39.95. That is what is awaiting us if we don't get the job done and behave in a fiscally responsible way. But as I say, the evidence for what good things happen when you're fiscally responsible, for one thing, once the government's out, the entrepreneurs are in. Once the entrepreneurs are in, then you have huge economic growth that's getting us out of economic problems just by all the job creation that goes with all the new jobs from the entrepreneurs. We saw this, as I mentioned, happen in the 1980s and 90s. And so I'm confident that or I should say, I think, we will move in that direction, and therefore we will be able ultimately to cut that debt down and behave in a more responsible manner. Maybe you disagree. How many think we will behave in a responsible manner? Uh-oh. Good, a few. How many think we will not behave in a responsible manner? Wow. Okay. That's an important discussion that you people need to have, your generation. You millennials need to have that discussion. You need to get the best minds among you working on that, because if you believe that's true, you're not going to be able to live to be my age and have the opportunity that I had. See, I came in while the rates were being cut from 94 to 28. And all of a sudden, I reach adulthood, and industries are expanding all over the place. Teaching positions are expanding. I had a benefit of a more responsible economy. Now, in the last 8 years, we have not been nearly as responsible, and you see it with the job market, and the opportunities are not as good. But they could again become great, and that's why you need to win that battle. It's an important one. And by the way, I'm really rooting for you. That's partly why I'm writing these books. Let me give another one away. It's my last one. This one's on Roosevelt, and this is the first term, the New Deal, and all the mistakes he made and all the spending disasters. Who wants this book? Come up and get it. I'll sign it. Look at that. The woman is already worth $1 million. She gets the free book. But I text you 500,000, so I'll give you that.
One last question here.
One more question? Sure.
This goes with the idea of balancing the budget, and that there's a common view that the government has to provide certain services, or else they would not exist. Do you have, well, I'm sure you have an opinion on it, but do you find any justification in that view?
Justification for which view now?
That if the government did not provide certain services, they would not exist.
If the government did not price services?
Provide.
Oh, provide service. Oh, this is good. If the government didn't provide services, they wouldn't exist. Then we have to figure out what it is government's providing that wouldn't exist if government did it. What would those services be? I'd have to know what services. See, the reason I say that, if services can be provided profitably, then entrepreneurs will probably emerge to do it. The only time you get the government involved usually is when it's not profitable. For example, you notice all the windmills? We wouldn't have those windmills if it weren't for the government, because they're not profitable. But the people who are critical of the windmills say, number one, it destroys all the farmland. Number two, that birds all over the place get caught in it. And at number three, the cost benefits are about the same as they were when the government was running the Telegraph. In other words, about 1 part profit and 6 parts expenses. So that service would not exist if the government weren't subsidizing it. But is that the kind of service we really ought to have?
How about military roads?
Military roads, that's in the Constitution. And that's what we did with the interstate highway system. And so roads have always been something that have been deemed a possible expense. Military, national defense. Because after all, the Declaration of Independence says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Government is instituted to secure these rights. In other words, government's role is not to give stuff, according to the Declaration. It's to protect the rights that we have to pursue our own happiness and our liberty. The government protection, sometimes military roads, could be something that would be under the rubric of a service that government might provide. So I'd put that at least definitely a possibility. By the way, I know some of you may have other events. I'll be glad to, I don't know if you want to make this the last one, and I'll talk with people. I'll be glad to be up here. Anybody who wants to come up after this question.
There will be refreshments outside. When we finish here, you can continue with the questions, but you and I can go on.
Go ahead.
Okay, so how do you think, how limited should our government be, or to what extent should we establish the free market society, or are there any aspects that should be paid by government, or we can give up on shoulders of entrepreneurship?
Yeah. Did I understand I want to make sure I understood your question. We should definitely have limited government, and armaments, sometimes that could be an expense. Did I catch?
Yeah. Like, are there like any activities like, I mean, I don't know, like for example, medicine, I mean, that should be paid by the government? I don't know, but for example, or, yeah.
Some people think so, but it's interesting how a lot of the conquest of disease has been done privately. Tuberculosis and smallpox vaccinations and this kind of thing. Historically, we've had really good success. We did with penicillin, the development of penicillin. And so you have incentives for private companies, the Dow Chemical types, to come in here and develop these products and do so profitably. So I think that the development of medicine is definitely something, it's hard to get that in the Constitution, saying governments are instituted to secure these rights. Governments are, if you're securing somebody's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I can see where national defense, like you need police, or somebody will steal your stuff. So I understand that. The medicine looks like it ought to be, I would say, in the private sector.
Well, I hope you've all taken really good notes, because Dr. Folsom has given you plenty of ammunition to help you explain the Northwood idea and why you are getting your education here. So, Dr. Folsom, we thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I'm sure you'll continue conversations, and I could actually listen to history from the beginning of time. So.
Thank you, Patty.